We're dealing with a respiratory virus, but we're going to wipe it out. We're going to wipe out all the toilet paper in the entire country. That's what we need.
Yes. You would go through less toilet paper eating Chipotle for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for an entire month than you would need from these people that are buying everything off the shelves at Walmart.
But we will have a lifetime of toilet paper memes.
Bringing you law, gospel, and guns. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Hi, folks. Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, the natural right of self-defense, and what God's Word says about the issues surrounding gun rights and gun ownership. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode number 212. And we are joined once again by our good friend, the pistol-packing pastor from St. John's Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota, John Bennett. And today we are doing something a little different. We're continuing our discussion of the coronavirus pandemic in our own unique way. We talked a couple of weeks ago in episode 210 about government and our relation to it as Christians. Today we're taking a little different tack. We're looking at government and its handling of major crises like the coronavirus pandemic, what we should expect of government, what government owes its citizens, how we should judge its actions through the lens of the Ten Commandments. Today is part one of a two-part series on that topic. We recorded this week. There was just so much content that I just couldn't put it all in one show. So episode 212 and episode 213 are parts 1 and 2 of this discussion. Both of these episodes, as I said, recorded together in one piece. If you're a member of the Reformation Gun Club, you're going to get to hear all of this in one show. You won't have to wait for episode 213 to hear the second part of this discussion. You'll get to hear the full discussion this week. The rest of you will have to wait for episode 213. But first, let's thank our awesome friends, the men and women who make this show possible, the members of the Reformation Gun Club. Armed Lutheran Radio is listener-funded, and that means that we rely on the monthly contributions of amazing people like Paul and Calroy and Jeremy and many others. And for their support, I am eternally grateful. And as I mentioned last week, since we are self-isolating or being forced to self-isolate during this crazy pandemic, now is the perfect time to curl up with a good podcast. And it's the perfect time to join the Reformation Gun Club and enjoy access to hundreds of hours of exclusive content. For as little as $1 a month, you get access to all the content that's available out there. We've got all kinds of cool stuff for you, plus some cool Armed Lutheran swag, access to our closed Facebook page, our monthly online hangouts, and lots more. Just $1 a month. Even if that's all you can do, that goes a long way to helping us pay for hosting and software and the services and equipment that we need to keep the show going. Check it all out at armedlutheran.us/gun club. Look for a link in the show notes or at the top of the website in the menu at armedlutheran.us. Okay, it's Coronapalooza here at Armed Lutheran Radio. 2 weeks straight, we're talking about this crazy virus. We're talking about the government again, but this time we're talking about the response to crises like pandemics and major disasters. As a quick primer, what are some key verses from Scripture about government and its role in our lives beyond Romans 13 and the admonishment to be subject to the ruling authorities, and Christ's words in Matthew 22 about rendering unto Caesar. Those are talking about our relationship to government, what we owe government in terms of allegiance and obedience and taxes, and the government's role in punishing the wicked. But does the Bible give us any indication what the government owes its citizens in terms of good governance?
I'm sorry, I wasn't aware there was going to be a test.
You were supposed to have had plenty of whiskey in time for this to be ready for these questions.
No,
Counting on your brain to be well lubricated.
you have now officially stumped the pastor.
Luther wrote about good governments quite a bit. He talked about how the power of government is derived from the home, about authority flowing from parental authority, that all who we call masters stand in the place of parents, and they derive their authority and their power to govern from the home and from the family. He talked about God wanting government so that life on earth would be orderly. So government, I guess, from the Christian point of view, should endeavor to do what? Protect citizens from harm without harming citizens in other ways, I guess?
The government, in essence, if you understand it through the principle of Luther's doctrine of vocation, that the government is supposed to serve for the benefit of mankind. To put it more narrowly, the government is to serve for the good of their citizens. And when the government ceases to do that, the government ceases to pursue the will of God in their role of the vocation of being rulers. If the government is acting in a way that is harmful to its citizens, well, then you have, the Chinese communist government. So, where if you dare to talk about the coronavirus, they throw you in jail till you're dead. So, we can look at. And we're told we're racist for calling it the Chinese coronavirus, but I since we can't use that term, I prefer to call it the Chi-Com cough.
The Kung flu.
The Kung flu. That, the reality is that the reason that we are dealing with this pandemic in the first place is because of the willful negligence and the malfeasance on the part of the Chinese government, where for weeks they were trying to hide this. They told the World Health Organization that this was not transmitted human to human, that it was transmitted by eating tainted bat stew. And for anyone who wants to criticize the Chinese people for eating things like bats and penguins and that sort of stuff, the reason they have to eat that crap in the first place is because they are so deprived within their society. They are so much under the thumb of iron-fisted government that in their destitution, these are the sources of protein that they can afford. Mm-hmm. And so if the Chinese government had been honest in the first place and not allowed 5 million people to move in and out of the Wuhan province during that time, then maybe this wouldn't be a massive pandemic like it is. And there was just a report today that if the Chinese government had a responsible reaction to this virus, that they could have reduced the number of cases by 95% worldwide. So thank you to the Chinese government. You guys suck.
Yeah. And people like Bernie want to bring us that kind of government.
And yes, keep in mind that in China, it is socialized medicine. So for those who think that socialized medicine would be the solution to this current crisis that we're seeing, if that's what you think, you're a moron. There is no polite way to say it.
There's just no way to say it. So from a Christian perspective, at the heart of any government policy should be the great commandment, right? Love your neighbor, protecting them from harm, preserving life, chastity, property, and reputation, right?
Yes. And where we run into problems, though, is when the government begins to see themselves as the savior of mankind, where they, in essence, become quote-unquote God by dictating to us what is for our good. Part of my frustration right now with what's happening with the current reaction and what the guidelines that are being set forward by the CDC and the government is, how do we know that these are really going to protect us? And B, is it worth completely destroying our economy in the process? Because in the long run, what if a dozen people are saved by these restrictions?
But half the country's bankrupt.
I mean, just think of it for those who have children right now, that even if they could go to work, how could they and leave their... Now, if your children are teenagers and you can trust them not to get into the liquor cabinet while you're at work, then maybe you'd be okay. But for my family, if it weren't for the fact that my wife is a teacher and has to be home during this time, that, if she worked out of the home doing a job that was considered necessary right now, where she wasn't being told to go home, what the heck would we do with our 3 kids? Well,
right.
I mean, for us, we'd ship them off to Grandma and Grandpa and say, sorry, Grandma and Grandpa, but they're yours for the next, 3 months until our country gets us figured out. But but this isn't just, it's not just disrupting the economy, it's also disrupting the family structure as well.
Yep. And we'll get to some of that in just a moment. Let's look at government at various levels and their responses, the different responses that we've seen to this outbreak throughout the country. The most common response is the one you just brought up, and that is closing public schools. Good idea, bad idea?
And here's the thing, that's where we can't really make a good judgment call on that, because we have no way to gauge whether or not this was a necessary step. We don't have any data to demonstrate that this is a way that's preventing the spread of the virus. So are we completely disrupting our entire education system for nothing?
Right. That's true. And one of the things that I've seen, Aaron Israel is big on statistics, right? And he shared a number of articles that have talked about the biggest problem that we have right now is that we're making decisions in the absence of good statistical data. We're basing it entirely on, okay, we've got this many people who've died, so we need to make sweeping public policy decisions based on that. Well, we don't really know, how many people are really at risk? How many people have been exposed? How many of the people who have been exposed to it have actually gotten sick? What are the other factors involved in terms of the number of people who have died? Are they actually healthy people? Are they young people? Are they old people? Are there other factors involved? Are we making decisions just based on... Are we making decisions based on good data? And I don't think we are.
I think we're making decisions based on fear and the insistence upon people who are panicking that we must, quote unquote, do something. It's kind of like the reaction you get after a mass shooting, that you have all these people begging the government to do something.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's great if the something that is done is actually towards our benefit. And one of the things that I find so frustrating in all of this is if we look at the model of South Korea and what is worked over there, that they have this virus very much under control at the moment. And unlike the United States, where, yes, we have these concentrated centers of population, but we have a very spread out country, in South Korea, almost the entire population is concentrated.
Right.
And so they live in a more dense populated areas than we have in this country. And yet, by asking those who fall into the risk categories to self-quarantine and have everyone else go about their daily business, mm-hmm. they've been able to beat this thing without completely crippling their economy.
Yes. They've managed to control it by trusting that their citizens will make the right decisions. And we've basically shut everything down because we don't feel like we can trust anybody to be safe.
Right.
Which, if you go to Walmart on any given day, it's not surprising that people would think that they can't trust Americans to make good decisions.
Yeah, we need to buy all the toilet paper, don't we?
Yeah. we're dealing with a respiratory virus, but we're going to wipe it out. We're going to wipe out all the toilet paper in the entire country. That's what we need.
Yes. You would go through less toilet paper eating Chipotle for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for an entire month than you would need from these people that are buying everything off the shelves at Walmart.
But we will have a lifetime of toilet paper memes.
But, you know, I have a very good anecdotal story that kind of demonstrates how this complete panic has hurt people. That I was at Walmart. I don't remember which day it was. It was just a few days ago. It was this past week. And I think it was Saturday, actually. So that would be a week ago from when this airs. That I was going down the aisle and we were low on Kleenex. So I thought. Turns out we had 5 boxes squirreled away in the basement somewhere. But there was some Kleenex, and I'm buying some Kleenex. And this lady, she says, "Oh, they're all out of toilet paper. I don't have any at home. I guess this Kleenex will have to do." And that's what this panic buying has caused, is for people that really are in need of it because they don't keep an extra supply on hand. They're having to go to other solutions.
Mm-hmm. It snowballs.
Yeah.
Like you, the people who are going out and hoarding it are going out and buying it in a panic, are buying it because of the people who are hoarding it. Not because they think they need it because of the virus, but because they're scared to death there won't be any there when they run out.
Right. And then you have, these people that are buying up as much as they can because they're turning it around and trying to sell it at a profit. If you're doing that, I hope that you are a believer in Christ, because there's a special place in hell for people like that.
I had a friend who came to Texas, to South Texas, for an IDPA match, and he was flying back to Phoenix, and he shared a picture on Facebook of the baggage carousel at the airport in Phoenix, and somebody had taken with them, checked as luggage, a 24-pack of toilet paper.
Oh, goodness.
To take back with them to Phoenix.
That probably cost them $25 to $50 to have that as baggage.
I've lost all faith in humanity. I mean, we're just completely, what will happen if we actually do have another plague? This country will lose just absolutely fall apart. Because I'm not trying to, I think our reaction last week to this, initially, you and I were both losing our minds at just, oh my God, how stupid people were being about this. But I thought our reactions in last week's episode were pretty measured. But at the same time, my reaction to how people are reacting to this is, we have lost our freaking minds.
Right. And I posted about this on Facebook. And this is something that I have done. I'm not like one of the crazy preppers that they have, an entire storage unit filled up with, toilet paper. I keep, and after this, I'm going to make
just
sure
a gun
I maintain
safe
my
full,
stocks.
right?
Yeah. But I have between 2 and 3 months of supplies on hand. And even though if it was available, I purchased it. And I purchased it with the intent, when all of this insanity started, that, if I have an older member who can't get to the store and is out of stuff, that I can provide for them in that case. If you're buying because you've lost your mind and you think that we're all going to die if you don't have 9,600 rolls of toilet paper on hand, after this is all simmered down, please go see a psychologist. But if you've bought in excess for the purpose of being able to provide for those who are less fortunate, that's been my mindset through this. Just as an example, my in-laws were getting close to out of toilet paper. I have extra on hand. They now have toilet paper. So I've been able to provide for them in this case. I want to talk just briefly about a different take on all of this. And the congregations that I serve, we did make the decision to cancel public services for the next 2 weeks and then reevaluate. And, even though it seems like a gross overreaction, this isolation for 2 weeks, there have been numerous cases that have been reported where you have people who are in pretty good health and they thought that they were perfectly fine. They just had maybe a slight cold, a little itch in the throat, that sort of thing, and didn't think there was hardly anything wrong with them. And turns out they had the virus. Now, for them, that's great. If I get the virus, I hope that's the reaction that I have. But the problem is you have, between a 5 and 12-day incubation period, during which time you are contagious. And then it takes 2 weeks for the virus to run its course. And if you have the virus and you are having such light reactions to it that you don't even realize that you are sick, how many people are you going to come into contact with during that 3-week period that you could infect, whose lives could be devastated because of it? Just, as an example, I don't want to give any names just out of privacy for the family, but there is a husband and wife within the community that they have the virus. And the wife had a pre-existing pulmonary issue where her lung capacity before she had the virus was around 50%. And now her because of the virus, it's dropped her respiratory function an additional 10% beyond that. So she's in ICU right now. There's a chance that this could kill her. And her husband can't even see her now because he's having to be isolated at home. There's an argument to be made for the isolation because in doing so, we are loving our neighbor and protecting them when they could possibly have a life-threatening reaction to this virus.
Yep. And that brings me to the next most common reaction that local and state governments have had, and that is to ban large gatherings, to say no more than 50 people. We're gonna cancel all public events. We're gonna cancel concerts and sporting events and parades and political rallies. My initial reaction to that was, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're overreacting. But like you said, the more I thought about it, this isn't really about the people who are attending those rallies or those sporting events. It's coming into contact with someone who might have the virus and taking it back to your vulnerable neighbor, your vulnerable grandparents, someone at your church, and passing it on to them.
Exactly. And I think part of the overreaction is due to, back when we had the H1N1 virus, the estimates on that is that 60 million people in the United States were infected with the virus.
Yeah.
That's not quite 1 in 5 people. So not quite 20% of the population was infected with the virus. And considering that, that's a lot of people. And with H1N1, the mortality rate was incredibly low. The mortality rate that they are estimating for this virus is much, much higher. And on Monday, which would be Monday of this last week from when this airs, there was a study released by a research firm in London that said if the United States does not do anything to mitigate this, they are looking at an estimated 2.2 million deaths from this. So I think that is what was driving this. Funny how we're listening to the Brits to do our homework for us. But I think that is largely responsible for the statement that came out on Monday from the CDC and from President Trump to restrict gatherings to 10 or less and to self-isolate for 2 weeks. The question is this going to be effective? We can look back and say, hey, great, it worked. but we have no way to gauge whether or not if we had done something different, we would have had a different outcome.
And are the models accurate? You know, we're talking about one of the big problems that we have with, say, the science of global warming is that we're talking about we're never really talking about good solid scientific data. We're talking about taking scientific data and then extrapolating it through computer models. And and so that study that you're talking about from the UK is modeling, and we just talked about how we're making decisions based on not really very good statistical data. Yeah, do we know whether the data that they're using is good?
And that's just it, is that how often do we see with any of these scientific studies where the researchers will pick and choose what data fits their preconceived model? We see this with global warming all the time. Are they doing that with this virus as well?
So now the next thing that is starting to happen more and more often is this these executive orders by local officials or by mayors or by governors forcing the closures of businesses, either restaurants or bars or theaters or gyms. Now, you may think you own your own business, but guess what? You don't. The government can issue an edict and close you down, and nobody has to vote on it. Boom, you're out of business. And like you were talking about earlier, this is, again, I get it for theaters where you've got, 100 people piled into a theater and they're stacking people in there as tight as they can get them to maximize dollars. Maybe gyms, I don't know. Maybe bars where, enough alcohol and people's inhibitions break down and nobody's maintaining personal space. But restaurants and then there's the question of, like you said, putting people out of work, and you're putting strains on people's incomes and their families and food supplies because people are having to stay at home and with the kids, and crazy people are hoarding, so there's no food in the grocery stores, so they're going to restaurants, and now the restaurants are closed. So now they can't even do that.
Well, and this is the case within my church, is that there are bachelors within this area that do not cook for themselves. Their food dependence is upon other institutions that prepare that food for them.
I remember those days.
Yeah, well, what happens if those people cannot get a meal now? I think the most...
You're going to be forced to learn to cook.
Yeah, exactly.
But you can't find anything in the grocery store to cook with.
Yeah. Well, I think perhaps the biggest overreach and the thing that you can most closely identify as totalitarianism. I gave the example of what's happening in Orange County, but the mayor of Champaign, Illinois, came out with a executive order that they could ban the sale of firearms and ammunition, of alcohol. They could seize your private property, and they could shut off your utilities. Think about that for a moment, where the powers that be have threatened you to keep in line with their dictate, or else we're going to take your property, we're going to shut off your power, we're going to shut off your gas and your sewage and your water.
Yep.
How long could you survive without those necessities? And this is something that conservatives don't say terribly often, but this essentially is, do what we say or we are going to commit human rights violations.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, I agree. Well, and for me, I think my attitude on this, on these kinds of things, or the attitude that government should take on these sorts of orders should be a little more nuanced. I mean, is the business you're closing down known to be a source of the virus? I mean, do you have cases that popped up in this particular business? If not, is there really a reason to be shutting it down? Is this place a place that has more than 50 people regularly congregating there? Is there any point in shutting down a small cafe, a mom and pop's cafe, just because it's a restaurant and we've got this blanket ban on all restaurants? It doesn't make any sense. It's kind of a blanket knee-jerk reaction that just ultimately it hurts more people than it's going to help. I don't think, like you said, with the first policy with regards to schools, is this going to actually help anybody, or is it going to harm more people financially than it's going to actually protect? And I think the answer is it's going to ultimately harm far more people.
Absolutely. Your choices as a parent, if you have children that are younger, is either you have to hope and pray that your employer will find some way for you to work from home. But if you don't work in a sector of the economy that's possible, then you either have to quit your job or shell out an enormous amount of money for childcare.
But if you work
leave your children at home and hope nothing goes wrong.
Mm-hmm. And funny how all this concern about saving lives somehow doesn't extend to abortion clinics.
Yes, I didn't hear the order that Planned Parenthood clinics should be closed during this time.
And then there's, like you mentioned this earlier, and I had an article that I saw earlier this evening when I was doing some show prep. State law enforcement agencies in Maryland, for example, had a press conference making it perfectly clear that they will do whatever is necessary to enforce the new executive orders in their state. So if you keep your restaurant or your gym open or your bar in violation of this executive order, remember, this isn't the law. This is a proclamation by His Royal Highness, the governor. The state police are going to come and they're going to arrest you and haul you off to jail.
Well, hopefully you live in one of those jurisdictions if you decided to defy the governor's order, right?
Right. But the motto of law enforcement is protect and serve, right? So how does this accomplish that? If you've got, like I said, the small mom and pop's restaurant, and your business has now been banned by the edict of the governor, and you decide, you know what, I can't afford to shut down because I've got to feed my family and I've got to pay my employees so that they can feed their families. How does it protect and serve to threaten those people to do whatever it takes to shut them down if they don't close their doors?
Call me crazy, but it sounds more like that's detrimental to their life as opposed to protecting them.
Exactly. Yeah.
But that's okay. They should just shutter their business because they're going to get that check in the mail for $1,000. Like that's going to keep them afloat through this. Yeah.
The government has punched you in the nuts, and now they're going to give you $1,000 and say, we're good.
Yeah, exactly. I think I'll use that $1,000 to buy airline stock. No, seriously. I mean, some of these companies have lost 80% of their stock value in this.
Yeah.
Well, and that's another thing to look at too, is that for those who are reliant upon their revenue from their IRAs during their time of retirement, they're not going to be getting a quote-unquote living wage right now because their retirement plans have completely collapsed in their value.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, let's look at the flip side of this thing where the law enforcement agencies are threatening people for not obeying the law. Saw this story in Kentucky where a man was diagnosed with the virus at a hospital and walked out. He refused to quarantine. He ignored the advice of his doctors. He's now under house arrest to prevent him from leaving his home. They've got an officer stationed outside his home to prevent him from leaving. Is that a good use of government power?
Now, in my mind, I think that is. Because what they're doing is they're preventing this jackass from going out there and infecting others. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, that there are some people out there who, because of underlying health problems, will have a life-threatening reaction if they become infected.
Yep.
And yet this guy wants to run around the rest of society with, his cooties and infect everyone. Cooties, that's not a word I don't think I've used in 40 years. Well, not quite 40, maybe 30.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm totally okay with this one. This isn't like where we're making hypotheticals and we're guessing that we're protecting people. This is actually protecting people.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I promise that's not coronavirus.
Well, I live in North Texas. If I start coughing from my allergies, they're gonna pounce on, throw a net on me and drag me off to isolation. Okay, folks, that's all the time we have for today's episode. If you have any comments or any questions, please visit our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback. Leave us a voicemail or a voice message or send us an email. We would love to hear from you. If you would like to hear the rest of this discussion, please listen for episode number 213 next week. It's part 2 of this series. You don't want to miss it. If you are a member of the Reformation Gun Club, you're going to get to hear episode 213 early. You'll also get a chance to hear episode 212 and 213 together in its entirety, just like we recorded it. That'll be this week as well. Be sure to tune in again next week, like I said, for part 2. Until then, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. Check out the Facebook page, The Armed Lutheran, or join our Facebook group, Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a comment on our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback or a review on iTunes and let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio, a member of the Self-Defense Radio Network.